it came up in a recent podcast that I did with Sam Sutaria talking about healthcare costs. And in that discussion, one of the things that emerged, which I think most people are sadly familiar with this statistic today, is that among the OECD nations, the United States has the lowest life expectancy, which is ironic given that we are spending on average about 80% more, and in some cases double what most other developed nations spend on healthcare. So how do you reconcile this? Well, Sam made a very interesting point, which is that's aggregate life expectancy. But why is that the case? That's because the United States has by far the greatest rate of death in middle age, right? So when you look at maternal and infant mortality, we're horrible. When you look at gun violence and suicide and homicide, we're horrible. And most of all, when you look at overdoses, we're horrible, right? So when you kill a whole bunch of people in their 40s and 50s, you cannot have a very high life expectancy. Understood. But what Sam pointed out was once an American reaches the age of, and I forget the exact age, I think it was about 65, all of a sudden they jump to the top of the list. That was very interesting to me. In other words, if you look at the blended life expectancy, we're not doing very well. But if you look at life expectancy, just in measured as years alive, once you escape those big causes of death in middle age, we actually do quite well. And it comes down to what you're saying, which is we get very good at delaying death in chronic disease. That's what I call the medicine 2.0 machine at its absolute finest. We are going to keep you along an extra 6 months once you have cancer. We are going to get you through that third revascularization procedure. And so now the question is, does that, because my intuition is where yours is, Steve. I don't think we're getting any healthier, even if we're incrementally figuring out ways to extend life in the face of chronic disease. I don't see it being a quality of life. Now, part of this might be, how do we define health span?
Yeah. So I agree with you. And I think it's even worse though than the way you laid it out. So if you look at the statistics, if you accept that 60% of Americans have at least one chronic disease and the median age in the United States is 38 point something, and then you think about how long are people living on average, that would suggest if you say that, and again, this is what you're getting at with the definition of health span. I would not define health span as ending once you have your first chronic disease, but that's the definition most people would use. If you use that definition, most people are spending 3 decades or more in the absence of health span, right? Or in sick span. So, I mean, the situation is, even in the United States where life expectancy is relatively short compared to other nations, a big chunk of that life expectancy is not spent in good health. And it's exactly for this reason.
But there are two different issues that are being confused here in the discussion. One is the issue of whether you can help middle-aged people live longer. And everybody's agreed that we're getting better at that. We're pretty good at it. And that certainly contributes to whatever you think health span might mean. That's an issue, however, that is quite different from what a concoction that slows aging do so by extending health span. Those both have the word health span in them, but they're different and shouldn't ever be confused with one another. The other point in this question you asked was, what is health span? My own personal answer to that is it's a useless term. That is because no one can define it. It's not because no one is smart. It's because the term itself is vacuous and nebulous. If you have somebody that gets a certain chronic disease here and then another one, and then they fall down and bump their head, and by the way, they go to the hospital and with COVID, et cetera, defining when in that broad, over that 20 to 30 year period, they flick the switch, now they have gotten to the end of the health span, is impossible. And of no interest. The general notion that people are interested in is whether you can do stuff to keep people healthy for a long time, either without changing their life expectancy or by changing their life, with changing their life. Those are interesting, but you don't have to assign a number.
But couldn't we get away, because I agree with you completely, Rich. I don't like the medical definition of health span, which I believe is, quote, the period of time in which an individual is free of disability and disease. I find that to be a very unhelpful definition.
Yeah.
But part of the reason it's awful is it's binary.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
That's silly. But if we made it analog instead of digital,
right.
I'm not saying that makes it easy. It's still very challenging, but now it allows us to start talking about things, right?
Or
As a person,
except it's a concept. It's a qualitative concept, right? I mean, I think we should try to make it to where we can actually come up with a way to measure whether we call it healthspan or not. Yep. That doesn't really matter. But I kind of agree with Rich. Like I agree with what you're saying, except I think it's a really useful term as a concept. I think it's a really useful way to communicate to a broader audience what one of the goals is, right? Which is to increase the healthy period of life.
Yeah, I kind of like the term health for that. I have a way that helps you out with your health. And you don't have to
maybe it's
pretend
function.
You can define it as a number.
But there is a period of, I think we all could agree, there's a period of life where you are in relatively good health. And then there's a period of life where you aren't. And so I think the idea that we're trying to increase that component of life is really important. So I don't think we're actually disagreeing on much other than whether we like the word. Right?
Well, I also think there's an individualization of this that we're missing. To me, health is a state of your physical being that you can do the things you like to do. And therefore, if you like to climb mountains, your health span is going to be different than if you like to play golf, for instance. And a lot of this is personal. You know, if you can't run a marathon anymore, some people will say, oh, my health is...
And we never pay attention to the mental health piece. At least the biologists don't. Right?
So I have a question for you, Steve. What is my health span?
I mean, I would only be able to ask you that.
Well, I can.
So we do this exercise, guys, because I completely agree with you, Steve. We call it the Marginal Decade exercise.
Okay.
So we say to every one of our patients, and I write about this a lot in the book, right? Everyone will have a marginal decade, which I define as the last decade of your life. So obviously, by definition, everyone has a marginal decade. Most people do not realize the day they enter it, but most people have a pretty good sense when they're in it, right? Okay. So the exercise we do is we go through with the patient and we say, what are the things that are most important to you to be able to do in your marginal decade? And they generally fall into 3 buckets with a sub-bucket: physical, cognitive, emotional, social. The physical bucket we kind of divide into activities of daily living and recreational activities. So that's where, again, most people obviously intuit that, boy, I would really not be happy if I couldn't take care of myself. If I couldn't get out of bed, get dressed, shave, cook, like that would be disappointing to me. But then, of course, you have different levels of ambition within the recreational side. And yeah, I've got patients who say, when the day comes that I can't heli ski, I'm going to be devastated. And other people are like, I just want to be able to garden, right? So that is going to create a very different standard. On the cognitive side, you have people who say, I want to be able to run my hedge fund and still make money and make really important investment decisions. And other people are like, I want to be able to do crossword puzzles and read the newspaper. And that's my standard. And again, we can go down. So this is why it's very, I agree with you. You can't define it, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to personalize it. Okay, but I want to come back to you, Matt, with the original question.
Was the original?
No, the original question. Why are we at a point where I don't, again,
why has longevity gone mainstream?
Yeah, for lack of a better way to describe it.
So, I mean, I think both of the points that Steve and Rich raised are part of the equation. I mean, I think it's a convergence of all of these factors and maybe a few others. I do think the science has matured to the point where more people are believing that we can actually modulate the biology of aging. I think the concept of biological aging has become popularized through a variety of mechanisms, including, some influencers, individuals who I personally think often err on the side of being a little bit less scientific than they should be, but I think they've helped popularize the concept. So I think it's been a combination of these factors. And why it has taken so long, I mean, I just think that's the pace that, science moves and the rate at which these concepts can sort of permeate the public sphere. So it's frustrating in a sense that it's moved so slowly, but I do feel, and I also wonder, because you sort of said, are we at a longevity bubble? I don't know. I think maybe we're still kind of in the early days of this sort of hockey stick moment, right? Where you're getting this exponential increase in attention. My hope is, as we go forward, it will become more scientific and less, snake oily. And it's a spectrum, right? There's this huge gray area in the field right now of what's real and what's not real. And I think none of us at this table actually can really define exactly where in that gray area that line is, or is there a line? So